Does Mikel Arteta actually need Sandro Tonali? Because when we look at Arsenal's current midfield structure, it's already packed with quality. Declan Rice remains one of the most influential midfielders in world football. Martin Zubimendi arrived to strengthen the base of midfield. Miles Lewis-Skelly is developing rapidly, and there are still other options available throughout the squad. So if Arsenal are genuinely considering a move worth around 100 million, there has to be a bigger reason behind it. And that reason could be control. Because when Arteta builds teams, he doesn't simply look for talent. He looks for dominance. He wants Arsenal to control matches, control possession, control transitions, control the tempo. And Sandro Tonali happens to be one of the few midfielders in Europe capable of influencing every phase of the game. He's comfortable receiving the ball under pressure. He's capable of progressing play through the thirds. He's aggressive defensively. And perhaps most importantly, he understands when to speed the game up and when to slow it down. Those qualities are incredibly difficult to find. That's why Newcastle fought so hard to bring him to England. And that's why Arsenal continue monitoring the situation. But here's where things become complicated. Because former Arsenal defender Nacho Monreal has raised a very interesting concern. If Tonali arrives, where exactly does everybody play? It's a fair question. Rice is undroppable. Zubimendi was brought in to become a key figure. Lewis-Skelly continues growing in importance. So adding another elite midfielder could potentially create a selection headache. Now, some people would argue that's exactly the problem Arsenal want. The biggest clubs don't worry about having too many good players. Manchester City have operated that way for years. Real Madrid operate that way. Paris Saint-Germain operate that way. Elite competition inside the squad often creates elite performances on the pitch. But there is another side to the argument, because top players expect top minutes. And keeping everyone happy becomes increasingly difficult when world-class footballers are competing for the same positions. That's why some observers believe Arsenal would only make a serious move for Tonali if a significant departure became possible. Not necessarily because they need to sell financially, but because squad balance remains extremely important. Now let's talk about Andrea Berta, because this could be one of the biggest tests of his Arsenal career so far. Berta was brought in to help Arsenal make smarter decisions in the transfer market, not just expensive decisions, smart decisions. And one of the biggest questions he must answer is whether 100 million is better spent on a midfielder or on attacking reinforcements. Because let's be honest, most Arsenal supporters would probably say the squad needs goals more than it needs midfielders. The striker position remains a priority. The left-wing position continues attracting attention. And those areas could arguably have a bigger impact on Arsenal's title chances next season. So while Tonali is undoubtedly an elite player, Arsenal must decide whether this is the right opportunity at the right time. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. This isn't simply about whether Arsenal can afford Sandro Tonali. It's about whether Sandro Tonali represents the best use of Arsenal's resources this summer. Meanwhile, Newcastle remain calm, very calm. Sources close to the club continue insisting they want to keep the Italian international. There is no pressure to sell, no urgent financial requirement, no indication that Tonali himself is demanding an exit. And that gives Newcastle enormous leverage. They can simply sit back and wait. If nobody reaches their valuation, Tonali stays. If somebody does reach their valuation, they can then evaluate the situation from a position of strength. That's why Arsenal supporters shouldn't expect a quick resolution. This feels like one of those transfer sagas that could develop slowly throughout the window. A story where discussions happen quietly behind the scenes. A story where circumstances can change overnight. And a story where patience may ultimately decide the outcome. For now, Arsenal remain interested, Newcastle remain firm, Tonali remains focused on his football. And the 100 million question continues hanging over one of the most intriguing transfer stories of the summer. Now, there's another development that could completely change the direction of this story, and surprisingly, it has nothing to do with Arsenal. It has everything to do with Manchester City, because while Arsenal supporters have been focused on Newcastle's valuation and Tonali's future, reports suggest Manchester City are quietly monitoring the situation in the background. And whenever that happens, every club in Europe pays attention. Absolutely. Manchester City have built a reputation over the last decade for identifying elite players before the market fully explodes. They rarely enter transfer races without doing extensive groundwork first. And that's why their reported interest in Tonali is significant. The current understanding is that City have other priorities. But if those deals become too complicated, Tonali immediately moves much higher up their shortlist. And let's be honest, if Pep Guardiola personally decides he wants a player, the entire transfer landscape can change overnight. We've seen it happen countless times. Players suddenly become available, negotiations suddenly accelerate, clubs suddenly become more willing to listen. That's simply the reality of competing against Manchester City. What makes Tonali particularly attractive is that he fits many of the qualities Guardiola loves in midfielders: technically secure, positionally intelligent, capable of playing under pressure, comfortable receiving possession in tight spaces, and able to dictate the rhythm of the match. Those characteristics are almost non-negotiable in Guardiola's system, which creates an interesting dilemma for Arsenal. Because Arsenal have spent years building a squad capable of competing with Manchester City, but now they may find themselves competing directly against City for one of Europe's most complete midfielders. And history tells us those battles are never easy. There's also another factor: the player's ambition. Because Sandro Tonali is entering the most important years of his career, at 26 years old, he's no longer a developing prospect, he's now approaching his peak. And players at that stage often start asking big questions. Can I win the Champions League? Can I compete for league titles every season? Can I establish myself among the best midfielders in the world? Those are natural questions for elite footballers. Now, Newcastle would argue that those ambitions can be achieved at St James's Park. The club still has enormous long-term ambitions. They have strong ownership, they have a passionate fan base, and they continue investing heavily in the squad. But the reality is that missing out on European football has created uncertainty, and uncertainty always attracts interest from rival clubs. Exactly. Because if Newcastle had qualified comfortably for the Champions League, perhaps this conversation doesn't even happen. Perhaps Tonali remains completely untouchable. But football changes quickly. And one disappointing season can suddenly create opportunities that weren't there 12 months earlier. Now let's discuss something else: the timing of Arsenal's transfer strategy. Because, from everything we're hearing, Arsenal don't want another summer where one transfer dominates the entire window. The recruitment team learned valuable lessons from previous years. They understand the danger of becoming overly dependent on one target, and that's why Andrea Berta's role is becoming increasingly important. Behind the scenes, Arsenal are working on multiple deals simultaneously, multiple midfield options, multiple attacking targets, multiple defensive targets. The club wants flexibility, because flexibility creates leverage, and leverage creates better negotiating positions. Which means even if Arsenal genuinely admire Tonali, they won't allow themselves to become trapped in a never-ending negotiation. There will be deadlines. There will be internal evaluations, and there will eventually be a point where the club decides whether to push forward or move elsewhere. That's why the next few weeks could be absolutely crucial, not necessarily because a transfer is imminent, but because Arsenal need clarity. They need to know whether Newcastle are genuinely willing to negotiate. They need to understand the player's position, and they need to determine whether 100 million represents realistic value. Because, let's not forget, a 100 million transfer doesn't just affect one signing, it affects the entire summer strategy, it influences budgets, it influences priorities, and it potentially changes the profile of players Arsenal can target in other positions, especially when Arsenal are also pursuing attacking reinforcements. The club still wants additional goals, additional creativity, additional firepower, and balancing all of those objectives within one transfer window is incredibly challenging. Which brings us to perhaps the biggest question of all. If Arsenal could only complete one blockbuster signing this summer, would supporters choose Sandro Tonali, or would they choose an elite striker? Because that's the debate currently taking place across the Arsenal fan base, and there isn't a simple answer. Tonali would strengthen an already excellent midfield. A striker could potentially solve Arsenal's biggest weakness. Both arguments have merit, which is exactly why this transfer story remains so fascinating. For now, Newcastle remain firm. Arsenal remain interested. Manchester City continue monitoring developments. And Sandro Tonali remains one of the hottest names of the summer transfer window. But as we've learned many times before, the biggest transfer stories are often the ones that change the fastest. And if anything significant happens regarding Tonali's future, we'll bring you every update right here on Gunners Unstoppable. Because this saga is far from finished. But Arsenal's midfield plans may not stop with Sandro Tonali.